the project use of substrate and matter and halomorphism from ancient Rome to early Qing China. Second panel, Latin philosophy in late antiquity. We will have three speakers, beginning with Anna Marmodoro, and then moving to Gretchen Redans-Schills, and then to Enrico Moro. We are allotting roughly, I think have been some changes to the format based on the experience of the first panel, and we are calibrating for 25 to 30-minute presentations, followed by 15 minutes after each one for questions. And then, if all goes well, targeting 20 minutes at the end of the session for general discussion. So the point being, if you have a question that is directly related to a point in the paper and seems most suitable to raise in the immediate wake of the paper, then please do so. I will try to act as traffic cop on Zoom, something I've never done before, but Nicola's got my back. And if you think that your question might be sufficiently broad that to hear the other two papers first, then please consider reserving that comment or question for the last part of our session today. And if that covers the preliminaries, Nicola, then I think we'll move straight to our first paper, which will be presented by Anna Marmodoro. The title of her paper is Successors of Aristotle, Stripping Away Argument in the 4th Century. Anna, as you undoubtedly know, is Chair of Metaphysics in the Philosophy Department at Durham University and an associate member of the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Oxford. She has many, many publications. I'll mention 3: Forms and Structure in Plato's Metaphysics, which is forthcoming OUP in August, as I understand. And of course, Everything and Everything, Anaxagoras' Metaphysics, 2017, Aristotle on Perceiving Objects, 2014. And she is also co-editor of Dialogoi, Ancient Philosophy Today. And with that, Anna, I think we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, John, and Nicola for the invitation. I have shared my handout in the chat, so I hope you all have a copy of it. The handout contains some of the text I will make reference to. My plan is ambitious today, so I'll just get started without further ado. I want to talk about Aristotle's famous stripping away thought experiment as he performs it in Metaphysics Zeta 17. In that context, Aristotle uses this experiment as a stage in the development of his theory of substance. What I want to show in this talk today, in the time that I have available, which is not much, is how Aristotle's thought experiment has been deeply influential on his philosophical successors in relation to the development of the theories of matter. Here I will focus in particular on Basil, Gregory of Nyssa, and Chalcidius, so taking together elements of the Greek and Latin tradition and culminating with Chalcidius, who has a fascinating account of matter, which merges together, I say, elements of the Aristotelian and elements of the Platonic account. What Aristotle's original thought experiment concludes is a matter of scholarly controversy. So here I just will need to spend just a little bit of time trying to say what I take the conclusion is and is not. And I will try to sketch an overarching argument according to which there is no prime matter for Aristotle. Aristotle's stripping away thought experiment does not conclude that there is prime matter, and when his successors apply the same thought experiment or their own versions of the experiment, they also do not reach prime matter. So the overall idea I want to communicate is that the stripping away thought experiment is not the route to prime matter, and both Aristotle and his immediate successors knew it. And so if there are post-Aristotelian philosophers who thought differently, I think that is a misunderstanding of how the experiment was conceived. Very briefly now, in Metaphysics Zeta 3, Aristotle aims to determine which of a certain set of candidates is substance. That is the text that you have on the handout as T1. The way Aristotle approaches this thought experiment is by working with the two different criteria for substancehood. Substance is non-recurrent or particular, and substance is the subject of all predications of what is in the substance. So let's consider these two together, the substancehood criterion. Aristotle begins in Zeta 3 with the hypothesis that the substratum is substance, because the substratum is itself not predicated of anything else, so it's non-recurrent, and it is also that of which other things in the substance are predicated, and hence it is subject. So it appears that it meets this criterion of substancehood. On these assumptions, Aristotle's goal in Zeta 3 is to discover that in virtue of which a substance is a substance. And the hypothesis is that the substratum is substance because it is the ultimate subject. Accordingly, Aristotle proceeds by stripping away all the properties that are predicated of it to discover what remains, on the understanding that that which remains will be substance, the ultimate subject. So T2 gives you the text of the stripping away thought experiment. Here I'm just going to zoom in the point in the conclusion in the argument of the argument that what is left at the end of abstraction is matter in scare quotes. Now, this matter in scare quotes, as I try to emphasize using the bold in the handout, does not have any being of any type, from any of the categories of being, or a negation of being. So Aristotle calls it matter, gives it a very puzzling description. What is this matter then that Aristotle discovered? And of course, the issue has been debated for centuries. It's not for me to summarize the positions in the debate here, but I'll very briefly simply give a couple of arguments against mainstream positions on this issue and give my alternative. Many commentators think that since in Zeta 3 Aristotle is looking for what makes a substance particular, he is positing something which is itself particular, to which the universal properties of a substance are somehow attached and thus particularized. And that this thought has misled many commentators to think that Aristotle conceives the substratum as a bare particular. Now, there are philosophical arguments against this, the main being, what could possibly make something that is propertyless particular? It remains a philosophical mystery. Further, the arithmetic of bare particulars is quite puzzling. How many bare particulars, for example, go in a substance generated from an egg, which has its own bare particular, and a sperm, which has its own bare particular? What happens to the two bare particulars when a human being is generated from the two, and so on and so forth. So I won't be able to really dwell on why I think thinking of that matter that Aristotle discovers is not a bare particular. I will not dwell on that, but I hope I give you a sense at least of why I think this is not the case. And then the burden is on me to say a bit more about what I think that matter is. Now, I want to make the point that it's even inappropriate to ask the question of what is the matter that Aristotle discovers at the end of his thought experiment, because asking the question presupposes that there is a thing or an entity discovered through the stripping away about which the question can be raised. But matter, in scare quotes, here is not a thing or entity in the ontology, because it has no being or the negation of being. Now, this is obviously difficult for us to understand, and it's difficult for Aristotle to express. I submit to you that here is a place where Aristotle is taken by the process of abstraction, and it is at the limits of intellection, as it were. So there'll be more to say to substantiate my point, but I just point you to T3, which is a different text from the physics, where Aristotle talks about matter and form, and dwell upon the difficulties of thinking about each of them separately from the other as being at the limit of comprehension. So I think that's the spirit of what Aristotle is doing in Zeta 3. He has reached through abstraction a place, as it were, where our comprehension struggles, and what he has reached is not an entity. It's not an entity in the sense that it has no physical continuity with the substance with which the stripping away had started, and it has no ontological continuity either, because at the end is simply deprived of all being. So on the strength of these considerations, I just repeat, I think Aristotle does not discover an entity at the end of Zeta 3. It's not the thing that we find there that is propertyless. Rather, and I have fuller arguments for that, but just let me give you the slogan, Aristotle discovers what I call a metaphysical conditions that properties have to satisfy in order to be in the world. That is, properties for Aristotle exist in the world as instantiated. There is a difference between a universal property in abstraction, say wisdom, a universal property instantiated as a Socrates being wise. And Zeta 3 is highlighting this difference, is explaining that there is some conditions property have to satisfy to exist, that is to be in matter, but in matter means instantiated. Instantiated means being a qualification of substance. Here, I could say a lot more, but I will not for reasons of time, but I'll just draw a contrast between what Aristotle is saying in Zeta 3 and what Plato would say in the Timaeus. In the Timaeus, we know that the properties, the forms, are in the receptacle, and they are as such. There is no change, there is nothing there to undergo in order to be in the receptacle, it's just received by the receptacle, and they qualify it. Well, Aristotle would say, no, when properties are in the world, they come to be instantiated, i.e. they become qualifications of a substance, that is the substance they make up. So there is a difference between non-instantiated or property and instantiated property. Of course, for Aristotle, there are no non-instantiated properties, but we could say there is a difference between abstracted properties and properties in the concrete substance. So I take this to be the main point of Zeta 3. And I'm going to show you that in very interesting ways, all the successors of Aristotle that we're going to look at today miss that important point. And on the other hand, they say a lot of interesting things about matter following precisely the procedure that Aristotle had introduced in Zeta 3. So I will quickly move to Gregory of Nyssa. And in this case, I'm leaning on work that I have developed elsewhere. So again, there'll be fuller arguments to be given. But here I just want to say Gregory of Nyssa and Basil before Gregory uses Aristotle's stripping away thought experiment with a philosophical agenda, which is very different from Aristotle. The problem for Gregory is how to account for God's creation of the material world, given what is called the like causes the like principle. So the ancients think that something hot can cause something else to be hot, a man begets a man, and so on and so forth. But divine creation is problematic in this respect because there is an immaterial world as creator of a material world. So immaterial God, material world, how is it that the immaterial God created the material world? And Gregory, I think, is extremely clever in using Aristotle's thought experiment to address this problem. So T4 is where you see the problem that Gregory is wrestling with. And my interpretation of how Gregory addresses the problem is to use Aristotle's stripping away thought experiment to show that matter is metaphysically a free lunch, insofar as matter emerges from the compresence of properties and does not require a direct act of creation of God, which will violate the like causes like principle. And here now we see how Gregory does that in T5 and T6 as illustrative text, Gregory argues by means of Aristotle's stripping away thought experiment that once all properties are removed by abstraction from a substance, there is no physical matter left as the residual entity. So in this respect, there is a point of agreement between Gregory and Aristotle. At the end of the stripping away, there is nothing left. But Gregory is not an eliminativist about matter, at least in my interpretation. For him, as I mentioned, matter arises from the concurrence of the properties. And that is T7 will give you a sense of how Gregory does that. So, in a nutshell, Gregory wants to have matter as a free lunch in terms of God's act of creation. Matter is not to be found when all properties are stripped away. So the fundamental entities in his system are the properties. Matter emerges from the confluence of compresent properties. Now, I will not say more here about that, although it's very interesting to say more about this conception of matter. I just point you briefly to T8, where we see Basil, before Gregory, also applying Aristotle's stripping away thought experiment, in fact, with the same outcome as Gregory. So for Basil 2, once we go through the steps of stripping away all the properties, literally nothing is left. There is no propertyless entity that we find at the end. So a first very interesting point I want to make here is the following, that if I'm right in thinking that this original stripping away of Aristotle discovers no entity, but rather a metaphysical conditions for properties, namely that when they exist as instantiated, the qualifications of a substance, well, Gregory and Basil in partly agree and in part disagree. So they would agree with Aristotle, there is no entity left after all properties are stripped away, but differently from Aristotle, they seem not to worry about the issue of instantiation of properties. And that might mean that there are completely different theories of properties. We will not go there at the moment, but I think it's just interesting to note. And now I'll just enter the third and main section of my paper, which is on Chalcidius, the mystery man we were mentioning before. Chalcidius has a lot to say about matter, and Gretchen will tell us a lot about what Chalcidius thinks about matter. But what I've done is to select some passages where I find Chalcidius using Aristotle's stripping away thought experiment, so that I can, with you, reflect on how he does it and what results he gets. So the first text I want to take you to is T9, where it looks as if Chalcidius, by applying the same reasoning of Aristotle's stripping away thought experiment, in contrast to Gregory and Basil and Aristotle himself, Chalcidius discovers an entity. So at the end of the stripping away, for him, we find a receptacle of properties that he calls matter, the gremium silvae, in T9. Now, T9 gives us a lot of food for thought. It's interesting that Chalcidius is actually following, broadly speaking, Aristotle's method of abstraction, but note that in T9 is abstracting away corporeal objects from his receptacle, from the womb of matter. So not directly properties like Aristotle does, but corporeal objects. And that seems very Platonic in a way, because Plato too talks of the receptacle as the substance which receives all bodies in the Timaeus. Now, presumably Chalcidius feels able to do that because for Plato, corporeal bodies are constituted of properties, the likenesses of forms. So Chalcidius thinks that when these properties are abstracted away in an Aristotelian fashion, then the bodies are abstracted away too. So this is a sort of equation between abstracting bodies and abstracting qualities that Chalcidius is using here. Now, T9 itself does not tell us much about the nature of this receptacle, but if you just want to scroll down a little bit in the handout, T12 makes clear that for Chalcidius, what remains at the end of the stripping away is characterless. Now, it's characterless because all its properties have been stripped away, they've been abstracted away. Now, this is Aristotelian characterlessness. So this is different from Platonic characterless of this receptacle. And that's another point that I want to emphasize. A junction at which we see Chalcidius merging together ideas between of Plato and Aristotle. So for Plato, as we see, for example, in T10, the receptacle is characterless because it needs to have some sort of universal compatibility in order to receive all kinds of properties. If it had any property somewhere, it would not be able to take in all properties. That's the argument that Plato gives. But that is an entirely different way of thinking of reaching characterless than the one of Aristotle. So what Chalcidius is doing is to find a receptacle, which is an entity, which is characterless, because all its properties have been stripped away. And you can see how there is a fusion of ideas of Plato and Aristotle here in play already. But the plot thickens in very interesting ways. So Chalcidius also raises a problem about substances and properties which had not preoccupied Plato, but did preoccupy Aristotle. And that is in T11. The question is, what is responsible for binding the properties of an object together? In T11, Chalcidius distinguishes two different metaphysical roles of matter, which I call containment and cohesion. Containment is a Platonic notion, is the idea is Plato's ideas of the receptacle that contains the likenesses of the forms. But cohesion is different from containment. Cohesion concerns the inseparability of properties rather than their compresence somewhere. And the inseparability that Chalcidius is thinking about here is not just that of opposite properties like the hot and the cold that many other philosophers before Chalcidius had thought about. Chalcidius is thinking specifically of the inseparability of all the properties that constitute each corporeal object. Now, look at this reasoning in T1. So he seems to think that if we separate by abstraction the qualities and quantities and the forms and shapes of objects, this leads us to first reflect on what that is which contains them all, embracing and binding them inseparably. And two, we will find that it is nothing other than which we're seeking, matter. So you see there are two steps in this reasoning. One step is raising the question, the other is answering the question. So in raising the question, Chalcidius makes an Aristotelian move, but in answering the question, he does not give an Aristotelian answer. Aristotle has a substantial form for that kind of job that Chalcidius is calling binding, and I call cohesion. But Plato doesn't. So here, Chalcidius asks an Aristotelian question and then falls back on a Platonic answer, that is matter, which is a very inadequate answer because there is no explanation on how matter can possibly do this binding that Chalcidius talks about. On the other hand, Plato's metaphysics does not provide any other means to Chalcidius to answer the question, and that's why he, I think, he just sticks to matter, while Aristotle has the substantial forms. For example, you can see the role in T12. Now, there is more that Chalcidius does that is related to this issue of stripping away, and that is in the really interesting passage which I have as T13. So having analyzed an object into properties and matter, Chalcidius then proceeds to synthesize the object in T13. And when it synthesizes the property to reconstitute the object, Chalcidius seems to discover that in addition to containment and cohesion, there is something more to be thought about, namely pattern and order. Again, this is a question that is Aristotelian and not Platonic. The idea is that the properties are not simply inseparable in a substance, but they're structured in some way. And then the question is, what's it that does this structuring? Aristotle would treat pattern and order as embodied in structural properties, the substantial forms. Plato does not have structural properties in his ontology, and Chalcidius is left once again trying to answer an Aristotelian question with the resources of Platonic metaphysics. And so for him, pattern and order of properties making up each object are preserved by matter. That's what he says. So where are we now? We have seen that Chalcidius, in thinking about matter, meshes together Platonic and Aristotelian ideas and ends up having a really interesting conception of matter, which is not like the prime matter that commentators attribute to Aristotle, and is not the matter of zeta 3, and is not the matter of the Timaeus. So there are at least three interesting original elements in Chalcidius' account of matter. One is the conception of matter as a receptacle that receives and somehow grounds the instantiation of properties, but also matter as the binder, the unifier, the matter that makes the property that are part of a substance inseparable, the one from the other. And thirdly, matter as the order, the structure that properties have when they constitute an object. So matter does a huge amount in the system of Chalcidius. And Chalcidius comes to this quite rich, thick conception of matter by combining ideas of Plato and Aristotle. And that is interesting and that is commendable. The thing that is frustrating, though, is that Chalcidius, as far as I'm aware, but I'm looking forward to hearing more from the experts, does not do enough work philosophically to explain how all this happens, how matter does all the things that it's supposed to do in his account. So to remain within the boundaries of the time allocated to me, I just want to now conclude with a couple of thoughts. Each of the steps of what I presented today would require extensive argumentation and textual evidence that I've not been able to give you for reasons of time. But I've been trying to canvas a picture that shows continuity between Aristotle and these thinkers that in many ways are very different from Aristotle. This continuity is around the famous stripping away thought experiment that Aristotle invents in Metaphysics Zeta 3. So Aristotle does that because he's thinking about substance. His successors of Aristotle use it in different ways because they're thinking about matter. So that's the first thing that I want to emphasize. Aristotle, at least as I interpret him, discovers through that thought experiment that there is something about the property being instantiated that needs to be investigated. And he will investigate it further in other parts of the metaphysics. His successors use the same thought experiment with different agendas. So we saw Gregory and Basil wanting to resolve a problem about divine creation. And then we saw Chalcidius being, it seems to me, clearly knowledgeable both of Plato and Aristotle and trying to draw together questions and answers from two different metaphysical systems and combining them in a conception of matter that indeed would do a lot if Chalcidius could tell us a bit more how. So in a sense, none of Aristotle's immediate successors seem to have picked up maybe they did pick it up, but didn't talk about the core value of the stripping away thought experiment, which I take to be about instantiation. On the other hand, they made creative use of this thought experiment for results that were more suited to the kind of questions these successors of Aristotle were interested in. So on this note, I'll just conclude. Thank you.